Good evening, everyone, and a very big welcome to the Trades Hall of Glasgow. I would like to thank Lord Lyon for giving me this opportunity to contribute to the commemoration of the 350th anniversary of the Public Register of all arms and bearings. And a very big welcome as well to anyone who hasn't been here before to this lovely building. It's the second oldest building in Glasgow that's still in use for its original purpose, and the oldest, the cathedral. Now, there is an absolute wealth of heraldry here. Lord Lyon has already pointed out the dome, but as you go through the building, you will spot heraldry in all sorts of unexpected places. Heraldry has found many uses over the years, from its beginnings around the time of the Crusades as a means of identifying people on the battlefield when they were all protected by anonymous-looking armour, to stained glass windows, beautifully engraved heraldic silverware, the modern use, for example, on business cards. You might not have expected to find heraldry used in the treatment of mental health problems, though, but that's what this story is all about. Sometime during the late 20th or early 21st century, a unique collection of hand-painted shields came into the possession of the Heraldry Society of Scotland. After some years of storage, a fellow member of the committee of the Heraldry Society of Scotland, Professor James Floyd, and I decided to investigate. The story took us further than we could ever have anticipated, into a world not only of heraldry, but also of great bravery under extreme conditions and innovation in the pursuit of a return to a semblance of normality. The shields had been discovered in a country house in the Scottish borders, Lennel House, near Coldstream, when it was being prepared for sale and for its eventual conversion to an old people's home. And they were generously donated to the Heraldry Society of Scotland, along with some other items. And at first, they sat in a number of cardboard boxes in attics and garages, until Jim decided to take a close look at them in 2016 and realised their possible importance. The shields were stacked in 5 large cardboard boxes without any additional protection, just as they'd been taken off the wall at Lennel House. The collection proved to consist of 259 hand-painted shields, and here you can see a selection of them. It obviously represented an enormous investment of personal effort and seemed to merit more extensive investigation. On looking through the collection, it was realised that the reverse of some of the shields bore the names of some First World War officers, including some very well-known names. Knowing that some officers had been sent to country houses to recuperate after the war, or during the war, and that I was doing research on veterans' health and recovery at the University of Glasgow, Jim contacted me and we decided to try and find out more about them. The first step was to photograph both sides of the 259 shields and enter the details of every one onto a spreadsheet so that we could work on them without having to constantly dig them out of the boxes. So, what was the story behind them? Our early research revealed that they came from Lennel House, which had been a convalescent hospital for officers during the First World War, and that the shields had been painted by the officers as part of their occupational therapy on the path to recovery. We decided to explore further, and what unfolded was a most remarkable story. Despite hopeful promises that it would all be over by Christmas, the First World War was to go on for 4 long years, involving nearly every family and costing the lives of nearly 750,000 Britons. Many more would be injured in the course of the conflict, some on more than one occasion, and many with life-changing consequences. For example, we tend to think of amputation as one of the signature injuries of the recent conflict in Afghanistan. But by the end of the First World War, some 41,000 British troops had sustained and survived the loss of a limb. Scotland paid a terrible price in the First World War, and some 135 people never came back, accounting for about 14% of the total British fatalities in that conflict. Many more were wounded, often returning with life-changing legacies of the war. It's often been said that Scotland punches above its weight in military terms, and these figures certainly confirm that. If you were at the Glasgow's War Sans Lumière event that marked Armistice Day in 2014, in the centenary year of the outbreak of the First World War, You'll have seen the names of all those Glaswegians who paid the ultimate price projected onto the cenotaph in George Square. It was extremely moving, not least because it took 5 hours to scroll through all the names on the Roll of Honour. But to return to the story of the Shields, it's time to introduce two people who played an important role in this story. At the start of the war, Major Walter Waring and his wife, Lady Clementine, were living at Lennel House on the outskirts of Coldstream in the Borders. Lady Clementine was the eldest child and only surviving daughter of William Montague Hay, the 10th Marquess of Tweeddale, and his wife, Candida Louise Bartolucci. After a career in the Indian Civil Service, the Marquess had eventually returned to Scotland, where he was elected the MP for Haddington. She had 3 brothers, one of whom would be killed in the first weeks of the war, and her other brother, Lord Edward Douglas John Hay, would be killed during the Second World War when the Guards' Chapel in London was bombed in 1944. The Warings had 2 daughters, one of whom was still a toddler at the start of the war. In 1901, Lady Clementine had married Major Walter Waring, who was the son of the MP for Poole. He was a career army officer who would later hold parliamentary office himself. Born in 1876, he was educated at Eton and joined the Life Guards in 1897. He served in the Second Boer War in South Africa and was promoted to captain in 1904. By the outbreak of the First World War, he was serving with the Lothians and Border Horse, a yeomanry regiment which was part of the territorial force which had been raised in its original form as early as 1797. After a short period in London, the Warings moved to Scotland and they bought Lennel House, which had been built in around 1818 for Lord Haddington to a design by the architect John Patterson. It was a fine country mansion on the banks of the River Tweed, and it came with extensive grounds, stables, salmon fishing and hunting, and even its own golf course, which the Warings brought back into use. Walter Waring's unit was liable for overseas service during the First World War, although they didn't in fact deploy until September of 1915. In the meantime, though, the Warings wanted to contribute to the war effort. The first major action of the war had been the German invasion of Belgium in violation of the 1839 Treaty of London, which had declared Belgium as a neutral state. The invasion began on the 4th of August 1914, and by the 31st of October, Belgium had fallen to the Germans. Inevitably, Belgian civilians were the innocent victims of the invasion, and many were killed, taken hostage, or captured for forced labour. The lucky ones crossed the border into Holland, and escaped as refugees, some making their way to Britain. By the middle of October, the Warings had opened their home to 9 Belgian refugees, and a month later they extended their hospitality to 8 convalescent Belgian officers. Their generosity is even more remarkable since Lady Clementine was already in mourning for her brother, Lord Arthur Hay, who had been killed at the First Battle of Aisne only a month earlier. But perhaps neither Lady Clementine nor her husband had any idea at that stage of where their hospitality was to lead. A year after the start of the war, Major Waring's battalion deployed to France, following a period of pre-deployment training at Sutton Veny on Salisbury Plain. Here in the left-hand picture we can see the battalion on parade being inspected by the Lord Provost of Edinburgh, Robert Kirk Inches, who in his civilian career was a goldsmith and silversmith and co-founder of the jewellers Hamilton and Inches. The blurred picture on the right is a very rare and intimate glimpse into the human side of deployment for war. In less than comfortable surroundings, in what looks like a barn, we can see, left to right, the commander of A Squadron, Major Waring, Lieutenant Thomas Robson Scott, who commanded No. 3 Troop, Lady Clementine Waring herself, the commander of No. 2 Troop, Lieutenant Lord Charles Hope, and his mother, the Most Honourable Hersey Hope, the Marchioness of Linlithgow, all gathered to say farewell the evening before they left for France. And no doubt uppermost in the minds of the families was whether they would ever see their loved ones again. With her husband now away on active service, Lady Clementine was now at home at Lennel with her 2 daughters, the 11-year-old Clematis, who was later to become the mother of the donor of the shields, and the toddler Cecilia, known as Kitty. Lennel was now fully functional as a convalescent home. Let's now take a look at the emergency medical facilities that were set up early in the war before we come back to the part that heraldry played in the story. Lieutenant General Sir Alfred Keogh had been Director General of Army Medical Services from 1905 to 1910, having himself seen active service in South Africa during the Boer War. With the outbreak of war, he was reappointed Director General with particular responsibility for overseeing the expansion of medical services in the UK. Very early on, he realised that the existing facilities would not be able to cope, and we must remember that at this time, prolonged stays in hospital were the norm, a far cry from today's daycare surgery. Within the first 6 months of the war, he had arranged for some 5,000 buildings to be reconfigured as emergency medical facilities to ease the pressure on the large military hospitals. Some of these were public buildings, such as colleges, but many were large private homes. Some were requisitioned, but others were volunteered by their owners. Given what we already know about the Warings' hospitality to the Belgians at the start of the war, we can be confident that Lennel was placed in the public sector voluntarily. These became known as auxiliary hospitals, and they varied in size and function. 25 large buildings had been chosen throughout the United Kingdom, including 4 in London, while smaller buildings functioned, like Lennel, as convalescent units. Specialised units were also set up for patients with shell shock or neurasthenia, which were known at that time as war neuroses, but today we would call it post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. Some staff were provided, including a matron and members of the local voluntary aid detachment who'd been trained in first aid and home nursing. Medical care was provided as needed by the local doctors. Discipline tended to be less strict than in the smaller hospitals than in the military hospitals, and the surroundings tend to be rather more homely. Nonetheless, the hospitals were organised on a formal basis, including having their own printed stationery and clinical records, as you can see here. Many of the larger hospitals specialised in particular conditions. One such was Craiglockhart War Hospital, set up in a fading hotel and spa on the outskirts of Edinburgh, and which specialised in what today we would call mental health problems. Interestingly, at the time of the First World War, there was a clear distinction made by the war neuroses of shell shock and neurasthenia and mental health conditions, which, long before there was effective medication such as we have today, tended to represent a much more severe and chronic end of the spectrum. Later, Lennel House would become one of the 4 satellite hospitals taking convalescent patients from Craiglockhart, the others being Bowhill in Selkirk, the Duke of Buccleuch's house, Eccles and Coldstream Mains, which all were situated in the borders about some 50 miles from Edinburgh. But Craiglockhart didn't actually open for business as a hospital till October 1916, by which time we have good evidence that Lennel had been taking patients for convalescence already for about 2 years. There's no doubt that Lennel was set up for convalescence in general, with no intention to restrict its patients to those with shell shock and neurasthenia, although eventually those did predominate simply by virtue of numbers. We don't know exactly how many officers were treated at Lennel, as there's no single source of information, but about 450 seems likely. The surviving 100 or so clinical records show a wide diversity of cases, both physical and mental. And later in the war, as the Spanish flu pandemic began to take hold, a number of the patients were suffering from debility after an attack of flu, perhaps paralleling the long COVID that we're seeing today. Even Lady Clementine herself succumbed to influenza, although she appears happily to have made a good recovery. The records of Craiglockhart War Hospital show that the treatment involved encouraging the patients to take part in normal activities, and that would largely depend on what they had been in civilian life before they served in the army. And that involved teaching in local schools, playing golf at the nearby Swanston Golf Course, writing novels or poems, or contributing to Craiglockart's in-house magazine, The Hydra. There were also opportunities to do painting, pottery, model shipbuilding, or even poultry keeping. Interestingly, these activities were organised as clubs rather than therapy, whereas today we'd probably have, for example, art therapy. The activity was the same. Only the terminology was different, but I think the distinction is quite important. Somehow joining an art club sounds much more like a positive step towards recovery than doing art therapy. Many of the officer patients had been through the most harrowing of experiences during the war, and what they needed more than anything else was to be able to restore a sense of normality and to reassure themselves that there really was a world outside the trenches. But as we've seen, Craiglockhart didn't open its doors until October 1916, and Lockhart had, and Lennel had been providing exactly this type of normal activity for 2 years. And there's another story here to do with an Edinburgh doctor who pioneered what he called ergotherapy, which was later to become known as occupational therapy. But unfortunately, time doesn't really permit us to go into that here tonight. It's clear, though, that it was these activities of normal life which Lennel was trying to promote. So we find officers going fishing in the Tweed and having some rather spectacular catches, painting, going for picnics, putting on plays, and going out shooting. You might register a note of alarm at the thought of patients with mental health problems being allowed access to guns. But remember, this was a very different world in terms of attitude to risk. And also, a lot of the officers would have been country gentlemen to whom using a gun, going shooting, was just a normal activity. And we have clear evidence that the officers did keep their revolvers with them at Lennel. After all, they were their own personal property, because we were still in the days when officers had to purchase all their own kit, which included their weapons. A bullet was even found embedded in a tree at Lennel not many years ago. It gave the groundsman a bit of a surprise. He was cutting the tree down and he suddenly found this bullet embedded in it. And it was identified as coming from a standard officer's revolver, so it suggests that there was probably some target practice going on in the grounds. They also, though, took part in heraldic pursuits. Well, why heraldry, you might ask? And for the answer, we have to pay tribute to the governess at Lennel, Miss Harris, who recorded her memoirs after the war. And here she is in this photograph, circled. She tells us that Lady Clementine was keenly interested in heraldry, and that round the beams of the big hall hung the coats of arms of everyone who'd ever visited Lennel, as we can see in this picture. Faced with many new visitors, adding to the collection was clearly a logical step, and at the same time it was providing another strand to the rehabilitation of the officers. Miss Harris takes up the story. She says, Lady Waring would look up each man's name in the Book of Heraldry to see what his coat of arms should be, if he didn't already know, and she would then set him to work in the large room that they called the mess room, which was used for any messy activities, such as this, and there the shields would be produced, painted in the correct designs and colours for each man's family name. Subsequently, the shields, about 12 by 7 inches each, were hung in line on the long beams of the big hall. The principle of painting a coat of arms associated with a family name for people who didn't have a coat of arms is, of course, technically incorrect, and I can see Lord Lyon wincing slightly there. But it reminds us of the bucket shop coats of arms that are sold to unsuspecting tourists as so-called family crests. So this diagram shows us what we call a full achievement of arms. We should note this is actually based on an English coat of arms. We should note that in Scottish heraldry, the motto, which you can see underneath, is normally on top of the shield. And also that the supporters, those two lions either side of the shield, are only granted to people under special circumstances, and most people wouldn't have supporters. But importantly, the crest, which a coat of arms is often erroneously called, is just that bit on top of the shield, and it sits above the helmet. So the tourist souvenir of family crests is wrong in so many ways. There's an important point of Scottish heraldry as well, of course, and that is that a coat of arms is unique to an individual. In a way, it's like a trademark, and it can't be used by anybody else, even if they have the same name, any more than you're free to use the golden arches symbol of a certain fast food retailer as your own, if your name happens to be McDonald. So, to ensure that coats of arms remain unique, for the last 350 years, since 1672, they've had to be formally granted by Lord Lyon, King of Arms, through a process which is enshrined in law. And they're registered in the public register of all arms and bearings, and of course we're here tonight in commemoration of that auspicious 350th anniversary. So here on the left, we can see the books of grants of arms that make up the register, now nearly 100 volumes altogether. They're all beautifully hand-painted on vellum, and as you can see in that left-hand picture, they're stored very carefully in archival conditions. On the right, you can see two examples of the gorgeous painting and calligraphy of each entry in the register. Of course, having the officers painting coats of arms was simply aimed at providing them with meaningful and enjoyable activity, and in any case, the shields were simply to be used to decorate the hall, not for personal use, so I think we can forgive them for not being entirely correct in Scottish law. So what was Lady Clementine's big book of heraldry? Well, there's an important clue on the reverse of shield number 195, which is for Dundas of Arniston. And we can see the words, the Peerage 1909 edition, quoted as the source. As far as we've been able to establish, there were 3 peerages, books of titled people published in that year, Dodds, Lodgers and Whitakers. We can discount Dodds as it doesn't have any reference to coats of arms, and the most likely is Lodgers, and at 2,294 pages, it's entirely possible that Dundas of Arniston features on page 676, as we're told here. Several of the officers were already knowledgeable about heraldry, and we know that they painted a number of the shields, although we don't know whether this was simply for their own enjoyment or to help out those officers who would have liked their arms displayed, but just whose artistic skills perhaps weren't quite up to the task. So let's now take a look at the shields themselves. All the shields are approximately the same size, just over 9 by 7 inches in old money. And they're all basically the same shield shape and have been cut from thin sheets of wood, either solid hardwood or plywood. But even within those groups, there's a range of thicknesses suggesting that they may have had to search around for material to make the shield blanks. And we forget that with wartime shortages, raw materials such as wood might have been quite difficult to obtain. 11 of the shields have small round red stickers on the reverse side with a coat of arms and the words Heraldic Office 92 Piccadilly, London West on them. These shields also have the name of the armiger, the person who had the coat of arms, in ink in the same neat handwriting, even if the spelling is perhaps a little bit questionable. And these shields appear to have been made by an established supplier of heraldic accessories, so they may represent the earliest contributions to Lady Waring's collection of heraldry. From the evidence of some 6 partially completed shields, it's been possible to work out how they were made. Starting with the bare wood blank, the shield was first painted with a matte white undercoat, certainly on the obverse side and sometimes the reverse as well, which provided a good canvas for the subsequent artwork. The design was then transferred to the obverse in soft pencil lines, using rulers to mark out quarterings and positions and the proportions of the charges. Some of the artwork at the pencil stage is of a high standard, especially with some of the animal charges. It's possible that some assistance from the more artistic patients may have been available at this point, with the subsequent colouring in of the shields done more as a sort of painting by numbers exercise. Some of the pencil lines may have been inked in with Indian ink before the shields were painted. The coloured design was then added in enamel paint, and some of the shields have in additional very important detail about who painted it on the reverse. 2 of these officers, Henry Hallifax and James Murray, have their names on the reverse of many of the shields and appear to have done the actual drawing and painting in some instances. And as we'll see later, they were both very accomplished artists and indeed had very fine coats of arms themselves. Some of the paint had flaked off several shields, possibly through rough handling when they were being loaded in and out of the cardboard boxes. Some of the colours had also altered over the years. Many of the shields were given a final overall coat of what had once been clear varnish, which has yellowed over time, so that a lot of the white areas now look yellow. And this is particularly obvious in the arms of General Sir Geoffrey Fielding. On the right, where the diamond shapes, or lozenges as they're known in the language of heraldry, are meant to be yellow or gold, but the main part of the shield is meant to be white or silver. With the eye of faith you can distinguish the two colours, but the white has yellowed very badly, and the paint's peeled off in places, which gives a rather mottled appearance. Blues and blacks also altered. In either direction, blue became black, but also vice versa. And here we can see that the word sable in the blazon, or the proper heraldic description, tells us that it should be a black as the background, but it looks to me, and I'm sure to you, as distinctly blue. And that caused an awful lot of problems when it came to trying to identify some of the shields. But happily, a lot of the shields have the officer's name written on the reverse, and sometimes some additional information such as their unit and the heraldic description or blazon. But unfortunately, it seems that some of these were added later, and they're not always accurate, which again led to some difficulties. Despite their age and their history, actually only 2 of the shields have been physically damaged. One, which was unnamed but now identified as Percy George Harvey of the Sherwood Foresters, has been split and the right-hand edge is missing, and we don't have the missing bit. And that's an indication of using sheets of solid wood rather than plywood, which wouldn't have split in that way. The other damaged shield, which is made of plywood, has suffered a very serious infestation of woodworm. And these early types of plywood used casein as a glue, which was a very attractive food for these wood-boring beetles. And almost all the shields have got a stamped brass mirror or picture hanging plate attached to them with tiny screws and often small nail holes as well, which are a bit different from the woodworm holes. But it's time now to meet some of the officers and to hear their stories, framed by the heraldry that was painted by them or for them. And we'll start with the Marquess of Tweeddale, who was Lady Clementine's father. And we know that it must be her father, the 10th Marquess, because this particular design of the shield was only used by the 1st to the 10th Marquesses. And in 1910, her father actually petitioned for a new coat of arms, which was completely different. So this is actually one of the shields that was professionally painted by Cullertons of London, as we can see from the red seal on the reverse, which confirmed that it was one of the early ones, and consistent with it having been painted before 1910, so very much part of that early collection. Here now is the arms of her husband, Major Walter Waring. But interestingly, this is an English grant of arms, and Major Waring did not register it in Scotland, so technically it wasn't legal for him to use it, even just over the border at Lennel House. But I don't think anybody was worrying too much about that. The first of the officer patients that I'd like to introduce, though, is Major Richard Berwick Hope. Although he came from Surrey, he has a clear Scottish connection, as he was a lineal descendant of Sir Archibald Hope of Craighall, the 9th Baronet, whose arms he painted, as we can see here on the right. The family has a strong military tradition, and his paternal grandfather, General Sir Archibald Hugh Hope, had served with the Madras Cavalry in India. Richard's father, also Archibald, did not enjoy good health, though, and he died of TB when Richard was only 6 years old. Richard decided to continue the military tradition, and as a young man he was commissioned into the Royal West Kent Regiment. We can see him here as a lieutenant in 1895. Like his grandfather, he served in India, this time on the northwest frontier, but he had some health problems, including dislocating his shoulder. For reasons that are not recorded, he resigned his commission in 1898 to become a portrait photographer and a painter of miniatures in the fashionable New Bond Street in London. His resignation may have been to do with his impending marriage, which was to take place the following year, as junior officers were not expected to marry. We hear a lot about the privileged background of the First World War officers, but as you can see, this was not always the case, and even those who came from well-to-do families often faced a lot of challenges. We've already heard that Richard Hope lost his father at an early age. Life didn't go entirely well for him after he left the army. In 1902, his brother was killed in action in the Boer War, and in 1903, he had a nervous breakdown due to financial worries. His shoulder continued to trouble him, and he had to give up sport, which he'd enjoyed. He had various other problems, culminating in the insolvency of his business. Possibly then, he almost welcomed the opportunity to rejoin the army, which he did on the outbreak of war. Interestingly, today, of course, he'd probably been found unfit for military service because of his previous history of mental health problems and his shoulder injury. But in wartime, things were different. This time, he joined the East Surrey Regiment, where he became a successful staff officer, although he did suffer from an episode of neurasthenia in May 1917, and he was off work for 2.5 months. There'd been more family problems. His elder brother was severely wounded in action on 2 occasions. And then in May 1918, he came under very heavy fire during air attacks at Étaples in France. And after a shell dropped very close to him, he had a further nervous breakdown. Unsurprisingly, I think one might say, and was admitted to hospital. When he finally arrived at Lennel in June for convalescence, the doctor recorded, though, that he was naturally energetic and a very hard worker, so it sounds as if he was expected to make a full recovery. So here on the right, we can see the Hope of Craighall entry in the first volume of the Public Register of All Arms and Bearings, which granted arms to his ancestor, Sir Archibald Hope. Unlike the later volumes, the coats of arms are not illustrated in the first volume, which covered grants of arms from 1672 to 1805, but you can see an illustration of the full achievement on the left. Interestingly, this is one of the impossible crests. It looks really good on paper, but when we bear in mind that crests were originally intended to be carved and worn on top of a knight's helmet, for example in tournaments, you can see that there's no way that a rainbow emerging from clouds could have been made to levitate above the Pac-Man-like broken globe. But to go back to Richard Hope's story, from Lennel he had further treatment at Craiglockhart, but in an unfortunate twist he had no luck, this chap. He then got caught up in the Spanish flu pandemic and was once again hospitalised. It was eventually decided, probably much to his relief, that he was unfit for further service, and he was invalided out of the army. He returned to his pre-war business as a photographer and painter, this time on the south coast, but he never really achieved the success that he might have hoped for. And I think comparing the 2 photographs at age 21 and 44, we can certainly see a picture with whom the intervening years have not really dealt kindly. His story illustrates the complexity that often underlies a mental health diagnosis. In a man described as a keen, hard worker, it was clearly not lack of moral fibre in the old terminology, but somebody at whom life had thrown more than the usual number of challenges. Much the same picture that we often see today in people for whom the stresses of military life proved too much. It also illustrates that mental health problems in wartime are not necessarily the preserve of young soldiers who are inexperienced. And among the Lennel patients, we find similar numbers of young and often more senior officers. Sometimes life catches up with even the most mature and experienced. We can only hope that his brief excursion into heraldry gave Richard Hope some respite from his trauma. And it's perhaps a pity that as a painter, his shield was one of the simpler ones and probably didn't greatly challenge his artistic skills. We now come to an officer with a Glasgow connection, Lieutenant Edward Fairley Stuart Graham. His story also illustrates the complexity that can underlie a diagnosis of shell shock or neurasthenia, or indeed mental health issues today, where the causes are rarely as simple as people tend to think. And at this point, I think it's worth mentioning that during the First World War, you often hear it said that soldiers were diagnosed with shell shock, but officers who had the same symptoms were diagnosed with neurasthenia because it sounded a bit nicer for people of the officer class. Having looked through a lot of First World War clinical records, I'm confident that this is another of the myths about military mental health that abound even to this day. A substantial number of officers were diagnosed with shell shock. The distinction is generally based on whether they were actually involved in the explosion of a shell, as many were, or whether they simply broke down with what we might today call mental exhaustion from the stress of their service. Anyway, to return to Lieutenant Graham, he was born in Paris on the 23rd of July, 1897. His father was South African, and his mother was the granddaughter of a Glasgow banker, Edward Fairley. Still only 17 years old, he joined the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry Regiment on a temporary commission. About the same time, his father revealed to him that the family name wasn't Graham after all. It was the South African name Cloete, and that he'd changed it to Graham, his father, when he fled to Paris to start a new life after a brush with the law some 5 years before his son's birth. The young Stuart was deeply upset by this revelation, and in fact after the war he reverted to the family surname, and he was to call himself Stuart Cloete. Despite his youth, he proved to be a fearless officer at serving as a sniper. He survived so many near misses that he was believed to have a lucky streak, but eventually he was shot in the shoulder by a German sniper on the Somme. While he was in Craiglockhart, while he was in hospital in England, he developed amnesia due to shell shock, and he was transferred to Craiglockhart, where he went on to Lennel for recovery. And his eventual marriage to a volunteer nurse is another story, which again we don't really have time to go into today. But he returned to duty after that, this time with the Coldstream Guards, but he was wounded again, this time extremely seriously, and after treatment he was discharged from the army with a war pension. So let's now have a look at the arms of Graham of Fintry that he painted at Lennel. You might notice that the register entry dates from 1971, which of course is well after the First World War, but a look at a much earlier armorial, that of Sir David Lindsay of the Mount, which predates the start of the register that we're commemorating tonight by 130 years, shows us that the arms of Graham of Fintry can be traced back a very long way. We might be tempted to think, with the story that we've just heard, that Lieutenant Graham painted the Graham of Fintry arms simply because of the surname that he thought was his family's before his father told him the truth. But in fact, he was a lineal descendant of Robert Graham, the 12th of Fintry, whose daughter, Christine Helen Graham, had married Henrik Cluter. So these were Lieutenant Graham's paternal great-grandparents. So like the previous officer, he has a genuine link to these arms, even though it took a certain amount of discovering. His military service now over, he went back to France as a civilian, but he soon took the decision to emigrate to South Africa, where he became a farmer in the Transvaal. Eventually, though, he gave up farming to become a full-time writer, and his many books include his 2-volume autobiography. I have to admit that this next coat of arms is not a Scottish registration, and I'm sorry about that, but I hope Lord Lyon will forgive me for including it, because there's such an interesting story behind it. It certainly took some unravelling. On the reverse of the shield, it simply says Falconer, spelt with 2 E's, which wasn't much help, and eventually we were able to link it to this officer in the Royal Field Artillery, whose photograph is captioned Captain Desmond Morton. Again, not an immediate association with the name of Faulkner. But once we put it all together, all the quarters can be tied into his family. And this is the proper heraldic description, the blazon, which ties in with the fact that he was the only child of Colonel Charles Falconer Morton, who was a cavalry officer born in Calcutta in India, and his wife, Edith Harriet Leather. Both of these families were large and very complex, and you can see them reflected in this blazon for the 9 quarters. And yes, okay, the mathematicians will have noticed that heraldry is into vulgar fractions in a big way. Much of the language of heraldry is derived from Old French, so the terminology, I suspect, Lord Lyon may correct me, may come from the French quartier, meaning a district, rather than a quarter, meaning a 4th part. So an area of the shield, not geographically or not mathematically a quarter of it. But to return to Captain Morton, he joined the army as a staff officer in 1911, and on the Outbreak of War he progressed very rapidly, becoming a staff captain in 1915, as can be seen by the gorget patches on his lapels, which at that time denoted a staff officer of any rank and not just a full colonel or above, as came later. His military cross, which he's wearing the ribbon of there, was awarded during the Somme offensive in 1916. In March 1917, he had a very close shave when he was hit in the chest by a machine gun bullet in action near Arras. The bullet lodged close to his heart, and it was deemed far too dangerous to operate, so he was sent to Lennel to recover from the injury. He never fully recovered his health, but by July 1917, he was considered fit enough to return to France, where he became ADC to Sir Douglas Haig, presaging a glittering, if somewhat clandestine, career in the civil service, where he was head of the Industrial Intelligence Centre of the Committee for Imperial Defence. In 1940, now back in uniform, he was appointed military advisor to Sir Winston Churchill, and this is his desk in the Cabinet War Rooms in London, which you can see to this day. He wasn't the only officer in the cabinet war rooms who is represented among the Lennel shields. We also have the shield of Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Battiscombe, who was the camp commandant at the cabinet war rooms. Major Morton was knighted in 1945 for his services. He never married, and he died in his 90th year. By now, though, you may be getting the impression that all the officer patients at Lennel were either members of the aristocracy or at least could trace their descent from noble families. That had certainly been true in pre-war times, when commissions had to be purchased at very great cost and were therefore out of range for anybody without a private income. But during the war, it was by no means universal, and especially later when losses had been so great that there was a need to recruit officers from a very wide range of backgrounds. One example is this gentleman, whose father was Donald MacLeod, the well-known bagpipe maker of Tain. He went to Edinburgh University, where he was a member of the OTC, and in 1916 he was commissioned and served with 123 Siege Battery, Royal Garrison Artillery. He was wounded in August of 1917 in France, and although he made a good recovery physically, his nerve was shattered and he went on to develop neurasthenia, as many did. And he was admitted to Craiglockhart, and after there he went to Lennel to convalesce, but he never recovered sufficiently to return to duty, and he was medically discharged from service in July of 1918. He was awarded the Silver War Badge. The Silver War Badge was issued from September 1916 to United Kingdom and British Empire service personnel who had been honourably discharged as a result of wounds or sickness sustained on service. It was to be worn on the right breast of civilian attire. Originally, it was simply intended to be a public recognition of loyal service, but it quickly became a protection from the wearer against the unwelcome attention of members of the Order of the White Feather, who were vigilante women who sought to publicly embarrass men who they believed should be fighting but were not in uniform by coming up to them in the street and presenting them with a white feather symbolising cowardice. Over 1 million of these badges were issued between 1916 and 1922, which is perhaps a stark reminder of the human cost of the conflict. But to return to Torquil MacLeod, after the war he finished his studies and he qualified as an engineer, working all over the world, including Nigeria and Sierra Leone. But then when his father died in 1960, he took over the family business as a musical instrument maker. The arms are of MacLeod of that ilk, which suggests that this was a case of an officer who did not have his own arms, because I've certainly been unable to trace any linkage to the main line of the family. And so, as the governess said in her memoirs, Lady Clementine had simply looked up a similar name in her big book of heraldry for him to paint. And this is another coat of arms which is recorded in the original volume 1 of the Public Register. Some of the heraldry was very difficult to relate to the officers. This coat of arms for Arthur Nicol Bruce was one example. Unusually, the inscription on the reverse was very clear as to whose arms had been painted. Not only that, but it shows who drew the outline and who painted the shield. Clearly, Lieutenant Bruce wanted to be involved, but wasn't much of an artist. As we've heard, Henry Halifax and James Murray's signatures do appear on the reverse of a number of the shields. But by now, the sharp-eyed with knowledge of heraldry will have noticed that whatever this coat of arms is, it is not a Bruce. In fact, it's Straton of Lauriston. Lieutenant Arthur Nicol Bruce of the 7th Battalion Royal Scots was born in Banff in 1888, and he was the 4th son of the Reverend William Straton Bruce, minister of the parish of Banff, and his wife Annabella Maria Duncan. William Straton Bruce was the son of William Bruce and Janet Straton. This is another complex family, like Captain Morton's family, and there's a clear link between Arthur Nicol Bruce's father and Straton of Lauriston, New Brunswick, which is documented in a privately produced book of 1939. And here we can see the register entry, again from the unillustrated volume 1. Of course, to anyone who's familiar with the ancient language of heraldry, the lack of illustrations in volume 1 doesn't matter, because the blazon, that formal heraldic description, provides all the information that's needed to paint the arms. We might notice, though, with Lieutenant Bruce being the son of the minister, that it's interesting how many of the Lennel officer patients were actually sons of the manse or went into the church themselves after the war, or indeed some were artistic, some were writers, some were painters, and it suggests that there was perhaps a rather sensitive personality that found the stresses of war rather difficult to cope with. It's probable that Arthur Nicol Bruce opted to have the Straton coat of arms painted, as there was already a Bruce shield in the Lennel collection. He was a qualified lawyer, and in fact he was a writer to the signet before the war, but he served as an infantry officer in the Royal Scots. During the war, though, he became ill with dengue fever, which is a mosquito-borne infection, and he never really recovered his health. He was sent to Bow Hill, one of the other Borders satellite hospitals, to convalesce, and from there he was transferred across to Lennel nearby. But his heart gave cause for concern, and he was eventually medically discharged. He returned to his legal practice in Edinburgh after the war, and afterwards he became secretary of the Royal Incorporation of Architects of Scotland. He was elected a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland in 1923, but in 1943 he died suddenly at the early age of 55, probably related to the late effects of his wartime illness on his heart. I want now to pay tribute to those artistic gentlemen, Messrs. Halifax and Murray, who helped with that heraldry project and assisted with the painting. Again, their own arms weren't registered in Scotland, and one of them probably didn't have personal arms at all, but they played such an important part in our story that they deserve recognition. Captain Henry Francis Halifax was born in 1872. He was the son of Benjamin Wilson Halifax, who was a tea planter of Darjeeling and Tiverton, and his wife Mary Ann Cox. He was educated in England, and he entered the Indian Civil Service in 1893, where he progressed rapidly to become a session judge in 1902, and later in 1913 he became an additional judicial commissioner. He was commissioned in the Nagpur Rifles as a second lieutenant in 1901 and had attained the rank of major by 1908. He then served with various other Indian regiments, including the Deccan Horse and the 2nd Reserve Cavalry. During the war, he had several episodes of ill health, and in 1918 he was diagnosed with neurasthenia, which led to his admission to Craiglockhart and then on to Lennel, although there is one document that says he had the flu, so he may be another of the patients who had this post-Spanish flu syndrome. In his letters to Lady Clementine after he was discharged, and the officers have left a rich heritage of letters, many of which have been preserved because they wrote her afterwards and told her not only how much they appreciated her care, but also what they'd been doing afterwards. But he recounts his dealings with the War Office, who had summarily terminated his engagement on the grounds that as a reservist he wasn't entitled to more than 3 months' absence from duty. Otherwise he would have been deemed to have concluded his service, which seems a bit unfair since he was ill. Interestingly, in this correspondence, he uses the term temporary gentleman to refer to his status as a reserve officer. Now, there are other writers who've written books more recently who've used that term temporary gentleman to refer to people who come from a social setting out with the traditional officer background and who served as officers during the war but then couldn't settle back into their former social group afterwards. And I think with Henry Halifax, because he was a colonial judge, we can say that that really doesn't apply to him. And it does raise the question of whether later writers have actually overinterpreted that term. Because we see that term temporary gentleman in other contemporaneous accounts that are applied to any officer on a wartime emergency commission. But to go back to the Halifax coat of arms, it was granted to the descendants of Thomas Halifax and his cousin Robert Halifax in 1788, and the petition had been made by his grandson, John Halifax of Kenilworth. Sir Thomas Halifax, who lived from 1731 to 1789, was Lord Mayor of London in 1776, and he was married to Margaret Saville, which accounts for the quartering of the Halifax arms with the Saville, which you can see here. And the Saville arms are the ones with the owls on, which will be familiar to anybody who's familiar with Leeds heraldry, because the Saville family are intimately bound up with the city of Leeds, and owls appear everywhere. There's even an owl trail, which is great. Interestingly, the Halifax arms are also attributed to the family of Waterhouse, which is also a Yorkshire family. And although the full facts of that are lost in the mists of time, it appears that the family did change their name at one time. So it's perhaps unsurprising that our Henry should have an interest in heraldry. The other artist whose name appears on the reverse of a number of the shields, is James Murray. Now, there are several officers who were named Murray who seem to have been patients at Lennel, including 3 separate shields for them, but the signatures on the reverse of several of them that have been painted by James Murray match this one. And he was born in Liverpool, and he was the son of Thomas Edward Murray, who was a well-known architect who'd been articled to Pugin. Before the war, he was working as an architect's assistant with Hertfordshire County Council. He was married and he had at least 2 children. But as James Murray is not an uncommon name, unfortunately it's not been possible to find any more about his military history. But his letter to Lady Clementine reveals that he attended a medical board at Craiglockhart, which indicated that he had a nervous disorder, and he was relieved to be found medically unfit for further service. I think we can understand that. And he was awarded a disability pension. After the war, he returned to his former employment as an architect's assistant. By 1939, he was a widower, and he was living with his son and his younger sister, who was also widowed. After that, though, we lose touch with him. But interestingly, that letter to Lady Clementine recounts that his wife and family were delighted to see him and expressed how well he was looking and how stout he was. And this is a theme that recurs in a number of the letters, where having put on weight is clearly regarded favourably by family and friends, in sharp contrast to modern thinking, and it probably reflects wartime privations. It's unlikely that his father had a coat of arms of his own, but as Murray is a well-known name in Scotland, James claimed Murray of that ilk for his own shield. I couldn't finish this talk, though, without including the shield of Lennel's best-known patient, Siegfried Sassoon. His story is too well known to need recounting today, but there's no doubt that he was one of Lennel's more colourful characters, and we're extremely fortunate to have his shield in the collection, with what is probably his own signature on the reverse. As well as exploring the heraldry, one of the aims of this project has been to find out more about the long-term trajectories of the officers who developed neurasthenia and other mental health conditions during the First World War. As you can see from this slide, despite their wartime experiences, many of which had involved great bravery, the majority did very well in later life. That's not to say that they didn't experience nightmares in later years. I'm sure many of them did. But they were able to cope, and they were able to return to normal life. Some served again with distinction in the Second World War. Only a very small number went on to have significant mental health problems. And I think there's a very reassuring message for today's veterans who may be suffering from PTSD, that it doesn't have to be a life sentence. But the most important lesson from the heraldry project at Lennel is that it illustrates the importance of keeping the mind occupied with enjoyable pastimes, ideally in shared and like-minded company and in a positive environment. And we know that for some of the officers it even provided them with a lifelong interest. I'm going to leave the last word to Siegfried Sassoon in a letter that he wrote to Lady Clementine in October 1918, shortly after being discharged from Lennel, when he said, "When there is another war, and all my sons and grandsons have got bow and arrow shock, I shall recommend Lennel to their notice, but I don't suppose they'll believe their poor old granddad when he says it was the nicest place he went to in the Great War." And I think that says it all. It only remains for me to thank the many people who've contributed to the project so far. Their help has been absolutely invaluable, and they're listed on this slide here, together with anybody I've forgotten. And of course I must express my gratitude to my fellow Lennel researcher, Jim Floyd, who's kindly allowed me to use some of his material in tonight's talk, to the Office of Lord Lyon for providing me with images from the registers, and to Lord Lyon himself for inviting me to come here tonight. Thank you very much.